Evening, everybody. We're here to talk about using behavioural science to drive trustee diversity. We've got two revolutionaries with us here, Dowshan, Humzah and Rory Sutherland. Dowshan's told me that they're an absolute pain to manage, and Rory absolutely concurred with that when we were on this call before. So I'm going to be cracking the whip. They're going to be awkward. We don't mind. We'll just deal with it. It's fine. Now, if you're like me, you'll know almost nothing about behavioural science. And I think that's one of the reasons I've been really excited about this topic, because I'm excited to know if there's something we can learn here for trustee diversity. As Daisy said, please feel free to use the chat, so add your reflections. Some of you I know do know about behavioural science, so if you're one of those people, add your reflections too, but if you know nothing, questions, reflections, whatever you like there. And before I bring in Rory and Dowshan, I just want to remind us all where we are in terms of trustee diversity. I know some of you are experts in this, so don't need reminding, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the last national statistics we have for England and Wales, and there are no stats for Scotland and Northern Ireland, the last national statistics told us that only 36% of trustees are women, that only 8% of trustees are people of colour compared to 14% of the wider population, that only a third of trustees are aged under 50, that only 25% of trustees are from households under the national median for household income, which is particularly striking when you think what charities do. And 59% of charities say their boards don't reflect the communities that they work with. And yet, in ecclesiastical research of trustees that's hot off the press, it's coming out next week, but we've been given a sneak preview, 79% of the trustees they questioned, and there were several hundred of them, said that charities need to do more to encourage trustees from a wider range of backgrounds. So we potentially got this gap between where people think we are, where people want to be, and where we actually are. And I'm just going to say something about why any of this matters, because I think most of you, you're giving an hour of your evening. You could be in the pub, you could be in front of the telly, but actually you're here with us. I think most of you will think trustee diversity matters, or you wouldn't be here in this session. But just to kind of repeat, this is about good decision making. It's about avoiding groupthink. It's about good governance. It's about access to innovation. It's about making sure that we're connected to the needs of the people that we're working with. And it's also about not limiting our access to talent. Talent is not just concentrated in the groups that are currently overrepresented on charity boards. It's evenly represented, it's evenly reflected across the population. So it's a total own goal that we're denying ourselves of all of that talent. So that's me done. That's probably the most speaking and the most words I'm going to get in edgeways into the session. So let's unleash the beasts here. And I'm just going to ask Dowshan and Rory to introduce themselves briefly-ish. Dowshan, let's come to you first.
Well, Penny, thanks very much, and thanks for the background. There are a lot of familiar names on the call. It's great to see, and congratulate the work that Penny and the Getting on Board team are doing, raising the quality threshold for all board directors, let alone trustees in civil society, but certainly all board directors in public sector and private sector. The learnings from here are transferable. What about me? I have a passion for things that are different. I have a passion for things of curiosity, which I think Rory will speak about as well. And asking those awkward questions, 3 words that sum me up would be succeed, serve, and share. And I guess we're all here, particularly on the serving and sharing element, to make sure our organisations and those who we serve succeed and do better. I think that's all you need to know about me. You can read about me. My name's unique, so first name, that is, and it's not unique, it's Dowshan, but there's only one, which I think Rory will concur is a good thing, that there's no more than one Dowshan. Rory, over to you, mate.
Hello, well, thank you, Dowshan, and again, thank you, Penny. This is a fantastically worthwhile thing. I'm Rory Sutherland. I'm the founder of Ogilvy, the advertising agency's behavioural science practice. And I'm very interested in how one of the great lessons from behavioural science is effectively around something called choice architecture, which is the study of how you frame a choice, or how you present a choice, or indeed the order in which you make sequential choices, has an enormous, disproportionate, but often invisible and unconscious effect on the choices people make. And that's both good choices and bad choices. Most famously, if you ever wondered how the Watergate break-ins happened, it's because various of the people involved had gone to the Republican National Committee with a far crazier idea. Okay. And their suggestion was they were going to hire a boat, invite a lot of very prominent Democrat politicians on board, and then in the middle of the cruise up the Potomac, have a lot of half-naked women jump out of a cabin and then get photographers to take photographs of it. And the Republican National Committee, not unreasonably, thought this was an absolutely stupid idea and said as much. Okay. Unfortunately, by setting the frame at a really stupid idea, a quite stupid idea, well, how about we just break into their headquarters then, came to seem comparatively sane. So understanding choice architecture, the effect it has often invisibly on decision making, takes me naturally to the subject of diversity in boards. I'm quite friendly with and a big fan of Matthew Syed, who's written the great book Rebel Ideas, which makes the case extremely strongly for having diversity in all forms on boards. Having been on various boards as a non-executive director and as a trustee of the Benjamin Franklin House, Rochester Cathedral, and also a member of the development board of the National Gallery, I'm also very conscious of the importance of diversity of conversation, not just diversity of constitution of a board, because there's a danger that they turn into kind of balance sheet discussions. That means that the people whose natural forte is dissecting balance sheets come to dominate the conversation, leaving me as a marketer who really was sitting at the back thinking, what I really want to say is, why don't you make the product pink? Feeling that I'm incapable of saying something like that without sounding absolutely stupid. And so understanding the importance of diversity in decision making, both for safety, in other words, it only takes one person to spot a ridiculous idea, but also for the quality and imagination of the resulting decisions, seems to me self-evidently important. I also really like the fact that you chose diversity in lots of ways: demography, ethnicity, gender. You can also add disability. I'll also add geography, because I bet you'll find they're concentrated around London disproportionately, because someone in Glasgow simply can't give up the travel time. But also, I'd add a few more dimensions. I think it's very dangerous using one or two of those measures as a proxy for diversity.
I think that's
because
right.
you can have an ethnically diverse group which are actually homogeneous in every other respect, for example. I'd also add cognitive diversity, I think is important. Not everyone's neurotypical. Disability particularly relevant for some charities, of course, but relevant arguably for all of them.
Rory, this is the whole point that we make. I mean,
yeah,
as a marketeer, when we look at this, we look at our target segments, we define them demographically, age, gender, the usual suspects. But the magic in marketing, that can be transferred across other sectors, other industries, other disciplines, is when you cut across. And the magic of cutting across is you could find people who are completely different. If we just take on my screen Rory, Penny, and myself, different in terms of be it gender, ethnicity, regionality, religion, the obvious things, there's something that cuts between us. Unfortunately, it's not the football teams we support or the other tribal allegiances we have, but it may be the way we think, or it may be what we believe in. But that's where the magic of the differences come off. I mean, Rory talked about cognitive diversity. We often use the acronym POET: perspective, outlook, experience, thought, social background, but bringing that to the table. And when we talk about behavioral science and the magic that it could bring, and the magic of difference, cutting across and getting those different perspectives, outlooks, experiences are critical. I often have challenges with, I can see a few recruitment companies here that I know, with recruitment agencies and search firms that talk about difference. But what I'm presented with is a person who is very similar in characteristics, but different in appearance to what's around the table. And I'm not going to get as a chair, I'm not going to get the dissension, I use that word deliberately, the dissension, the challenge that I want, and ultimately the representation of those whom we serve. This representation shapes policy and enhances quality. And it's something that I keep going on about. And this is where the magic of, certainly I'm biased here as a marketeer as well, but if marketing behavioral science can come into play, I think we've got some great examples of how we use those concepts to improve the composition of our teams, our boards, and what we deliver to our communities we serve.
Also, when you talk about the ability to cut across, there's some sort of suggestion, I think, in science that the greatest scientific progress is not made anymore within fields, it's made in the intersection of different fields. So there may always be a temptation to hire a specialist in a particular area for a particular role. But if you've got someone who's a little bit, say, T-shaped at the very least, that's an additional benefit, undoubtedly. And I think also, the POETS acronym is very, very useful. Two experiences I've had in the last 5 years, which I found particularly revealing. I spent 24 hours in prison in Qatar, for vaping on a plane. I also, about 3 months ago, had a very bad bout of sciatica. And what interested me about both experiences, both being in prison and effectively being temporarily disabled, is that they're both impossible to recreate in the imagination. You have to experience them to know what they're like. So a breadth of experience, a breadth of outlook, a breadth of perspective. There's a wonderful quote from the software guru called, I think he's called Brian Kay, who says, "A change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points." And I think that's fundamentally true.
So that's great, thank you.
And our gatekeepers need to take count of. When we talk about the magic between, we're coming to the end of the year, and one of the boards that I serve on, again, a charity, Gresham College, one of our illustrious former professors, about 300 years ago, is, or was, I should say, Sir Christopher Wren. And we talk about him as, I think, as a professor of geometry for us, which is a term we use for maths, but an astronomer, an architect, an anatomist. I mean, his talent spread across so many areas, but his magic may be evident to people in a few. And it's that magic across the areas that we miss, particularly in boardrooms, where we may be overstaffed with folk of a certain background and folk of a certain experience. And marketing, when we cut across areas and we look for different experiences, different perspectives, that's when we truly see transformational change. So whilst organizations, particularly organizations in civil society, are challenged by the disruption we have, we ain't going to solve the problems with the same old thinking. We need completely different, disruptive, and dare I say it, and I mean this as a chair, dissentives thinking that can move us all forward. We can't wait for another pandemic to happen to suddenly go, hey, let's all work from home. Let's all get on a screen and get together on Zoom. Some of us were doing that 20 years ago. But we don't have
if I can just come in here, gents. Thank you for absolutely, Rory, that your points about diversity being broader than the statistics I gave. We are really limited by the statistics we have for the charity sector. There are no, so for example, there are no national statistics on disability. When that survey was commissioned by the Charity Commission, they didn't add it in. We're campaigning for that to change. I'd really love to talk more about how we can redefine what we're looking for from trustees. So you're talking about, we have this stencil idea of what a good trustee is, and then we recruit one of them, and then we squidge them together. How can we redefine what we're recruiting, and how might behavioural science come into that?
One thing I think you can do, which is something which I suggested and which was picked up, I thought maybe this is a mad idea, but it was picked up by people like Tim Harford, of the Radio 4 programme, as a statistician and economist, which is, if it's at all possible, hire people in groups simultaneously rather than one person at a time. Because there's quite a lot of evidence that when you hire one person at a time, you hire much more conservatively. Whereas if you're hiring 3 or 4 or 5 people at a time, you tend to look for complementarity, and you tend to look for variance when you hire in a group and conformity when you hire an individual. Apart from anything else, by the way, when you hire 5 people, you're probably a little less risk averse than when you hire 1. So if you imagine you hire one person and, if you imagine you hire one person who insists on wearing a giant orange wig, okay? I know this sounds a ridiculous example, right? For whatever reason. They become very noticeable as an unusual hire, and therefore, if it goes wrong, you're not described as unlucky, you're seen as being foolish. Whereas if you hire 5 people, it's accepted that 1 or 2 of those aren't going to work out anyway, or I'm talking about commercial employment, and therefore there isn't that same level of blame avoidance or just distinctiveness avoidance. A very large part of business activity is avoiding doing anything distinctive, so that by not arousing any attention, you never also attract any blame. And so, I think that's one really important thing. By the way, one other point I was going to make, Dowshan just mentioned the pandemic. There are forms of diversity and prejudice which are doubly invisible, in the sense that you can't really quantify them. I mean, you can define people by ethnicity, you can define people by wealth. There's a huge correlation between the number of books people's parents had in their house and their likely educational performance, for example. But there's no data existing on that. That was the result of a small study. So, I mean, I always tease the advertising industry by saying you're very, very active in lots of forms of diversity, but the best attested bias in social science is a bias towards attractive people. And the advertising agency, the advertising industry is disproportionately inclined to hire good-looking people without even realizing it. The other form of bias, which I think is weirdly invisible, is simply geographical, which is, if the 4 meetings are all in London and you have to attend all 4 in person, well, the opportunity cost of the meeting for a Londoner is probably an afternoon. The opportunity cost for a Glaswegian is a day and a half. Plus, if they don't feel like claiming for their travel, a sort of £400 annual expense. And one thing I do believe very strongly is that actually by having a Zoom or remote option for some, maybe not all, but some of the meetings, maybe you make 2 annual meetings physical or 1 absolutely physical, and the other 3 there's an option of attending remotely. It inordinately changes the mathematics of who can join. I mean, I'm always ranting at the ad agency because I say, you also have an extraordinary bias in that, think about it, okay? Can anybody over 30 really move to London from somewhere else? And I'd argue that for many, many people, once you have children, perhaps once you're married, it's more or less impossible to move to London over the age of 30. And therefore, by only recruiting people who can basically travel to London 5 days a week, you're restricting your recruitment pool to really probably a fifth of the UK population.
And I guess for back to trustees, I think you're absolutely right that national organisations, many of which are based in London, have trustee boards that are predominantly made of people who live in London for practical and other reasons, and that and organisations that are representing and serving people who live everywhere have their leadership based in London. I think that's right. What I'd love to do is to invite the people watching to share their thoughts in the chat about why aren't our trustees more diverse? What is stopping people from becoming trustees? What is stopping organisations from recruiting from a broader range of people? And it doesn't have to be well thought through, long answers. Just give us some snap. What are the barriers? What are the things that are stopping us having more diverse boards? And then I'd love to invite Dowshan and Rory to talk about some of those barriers and what we might do to remove them.
There's a good point on the chat. I think Cynthia speaking about Mind and saying they recruit in batches of 3. Now, I think that's absolutely fantastic. And unfortunately, when you see recruitment ads, they're generally for the one person, or we recruit generally for the one person, the CEO, the executive director of fundraising. At the moment, I've got a CEO search on, but I also have a trustee search on, and I'm in, I say, a privileged position of needing circa 5+ trustees. In fact, the recruiter who's leading that for me is on this call at the moment. And there's Matt from TPP, Matt. So we're in a wonderful position where we can talk about the vision of the organisation, how we're serving our community, what we'd like to do differently. And then going back to that POETS acronym, somebody's put in the chat, what did it stand for? Perspective, outlook, experience, thought, social background, sector, because I came up with it, I can add as many S's as I want to it. But by bringing that POETS acronym into play, it allows recruiters to think widely about the kind of people we want, the kind of experiences they have, and the skills that they bring, regardless of the very demographic verticals that we could look at. Now, through that, I know one form of diversity would be a proxy for another, but we end up with a better result. So being able to recruit in groups allows you to recruit the more maverick, the individuals that you wouldn't have thought. But then from a behavioural point of view, if you are that one maverick, a bit like we talk about women on boards, having that one woman on a board, one then done, it makes it harder for that one individual, given A, maybe their physical characteristics, but B, what they bring in terms of their experience, their heart and their mind, into the difference of that board to be more effective and better serve its consumers, its citizens, its community. So the recruiting in batches and thinking about the number of different viewpoints you want is absolutely critical. And we're fortunate to be able to do that on one of the boards that I lead. I think when we go broader in terms of how we nudge people now, getting a recruiter, getting your non-com or people committee to look at the stats from a funnel perspective, i.e. who's applying. And you're right, Penny, we don't have data for all the forms of diversity, or as Rory inferred, the different forms of diversity. You couldn't guess my social background or my upbringing, or maybe a football team I support, you could, but you couldn't guess the invisible aspects of me, or you couldn't capture them as a metric. But capturing some metrics of who's applying, where they're applying from, and following it through first interview, second interview, appointment, allows you to then have a better hypothesis. Are we attracting the right people? Are those people interested in our proposition? Maybe they're not. Do we have biases at each stage of the funnel? But it nudges you a certain way when you have data like that. And I've used it in professorial recruitment, where you can have the most phenomenal backgrounds, but certain academic disciplines are dominated by certain folk. And we can see from those who apply, despite outreach, that we may not get the numbers in to be able to get down to a more viable final list of candidates. But just using data a bit more proactively and differently can nudge us in the right direction to make more meaningful appointments. But overall, yes, having been there and recruited singly and in groups, recruiting in groups, and then being able to get more of the mavericks in front of your traditional gatekeepers and then appoint them more than singularly is absolutely critical.
And that feels like that's a good tip and an easy win, isn't it? Because I think unlike staff recruitment for a small organisation, we often have the capacity to recruit multiple trustees in a way that we couldn't just say, oh, we'll have 5 new members of staff with no kind of consideration of how we're going to pay for them. So that's great. So you talked a bit about, I guess, recruitment behaviours from the organisational side. What about pipeline? So how do we, I guess, support and encourage and include people who are currently underrepresented on trustee boards? What are the behaviours that we might nudge on that side of things? Rory, any thoughts?
There's one thing, by the way, in addition to recruiting in groups, which I think leads you to be diverse instinctively rather than consciously, which is probably better, by the way. I mean, I don't think, if you have one position to fill, I don't think you should necessarily, choose a less strong candidate just to tick a single box, okay? There is another finding from a Harvard Business Review paper, which suggests that if you're the only one of any type, man, woman, black, white, being considered for a role, your odds fall dramatically. Whereas if there are 2 of you of any kind, this could be, to take an extreme example, if one person insists on turning up to interview wearing a top hat, they stand absolutely 0 chance of being hired. If 2 people do, their odds of being hired return more or less to normal. And why that happens, I'm not fully sure. But one really important thing is that in fact, the token X is a terrible mistake, because you actually need 2 before our judgment returns to a kind of statistical normal. I'm not sure why that is, by the way.
Actually, that's come up very, very strongly all week, and in all of Getting on Board's work, that really doesn't work for the individual either, does it? If you're, the only person, if you're 30 years younger, for example, than everybody else on the board, that's likely to put you in a really, really difficult position, and you're unlikely to be able to contribute as equally to other people, because you're out on a limb, aren't you? You feel like a fish out of water.
Well, there's a very interesting thing which fascinates
inclusive environment then. So in terms of being an effective board, you're going to take a step backwards, and then the individual's experiences harms them from applying again. There are often times that I'm asked to provide recommendations for organizations, but the individual has been hurt either from their own experience, or she's been the lone voice, or she's seen behavior untoward. So that experience then further limits support. So there's a comment here about imagination. We have to be different in how we approach people, in how we engage them, and then the behaviors we exhibit when they're around, and to be more inclusive, even if they will be the one initially, but that has to change. So when we recruit more broadly, and they can see that difference, and that they can see that a different challenging viewpoint or dissension is welcome, that is key. So the chair and the board collectively need a culture that is welcoming of that will hear the difference, that will listen to the person at the back in the purple shirt saying it should be pink, because it would probably have more merit than the traditional linear left brain discussions that 99% of boards have 99% of the time.
I mean, there's a very interesting finding which no one's mentioned, but it's always struck me as possibly significant, which is if you look at Barack Obama, you look at Kamala Harris, you look at Colin Powell, one of the most successful immigrant groups in the United States is actually Jamaican, or Caribbean, technically. I think Kamala is half Jamaican, and of course Barack Obama is half Kenyan. There must be some component to that, which is that all of them had parents who didn't grow up as a minority group. Because if you live in Jamaica, yes, you grew up under a sort of colonial system, but most of the doctors were still black, for example. Okay? There wasn't that weird, there wasn't that weird American system where every single position of power was occupied more or less exclusively by white people, and that you had in a sense no role models at all. So it's, it always strikes me as quite interesting that I think Colin Powell's Jamaican, I think Kamala Harris is half Jamaican, that coming from that kind of background is just fundamentally different in some sort of mindset. And I think it just deserves further investigation.
And I guess applying that thought, Rory, to trusteeship, we need role models. We need role models, people who are trustees, who are from one or more underrepresented groups. And there are many people actually already fulfilling this role. But how can we use role models, or how can role models use themselves, put themselves out there to say, look, I did this thing, I'm going to lower down the ladder and perhaps you'd like to do it too.
Penny, I think this is where we also have to be careful. I mean, of course, we all have to raise the ladder. The only time you're looking down upon someone is when you're helping them rise up. But we've got to be careful. And I think a lot of underestimated folks speak about this. You have a job description that's here. If you're already underestimated, a term I use, whether it's women on boards or ethnic minorities, people from a different social background, if you're underestimated or different, your job description has gone there. And now you want me to be a role model as well? That's my job description. So suddenly, what the average person, dare I say mediocre person, can get away with is here. But now you expect me to perform up here. And let me go off the screen, up there. So yes, of course, I said it, representation shapes policy, enhances quality. We know the other cliche as well, you can't be what you can't see. So yes, we do need role models, but let us also understand that there is a cost to someone who's already not privileged or underestimated, that generally we have to perform here, given our social background, maybe our faith, maybe our ethnicity, maybe our gender, maybe our disability, etc. And now you want me to be a role model on top of that and to attend all these other events? That's my job description.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a good point, well made, Dowshan. Thank you. And I think in my mind, I was thinking people were putting themselves forward, but actually, as the person who's regularly in a previous job, I was regularly kind of wheeled out as, oh, here's the poor kid done good. Here's the poor kid who ended up at Cambridge. It's bloody tiresome, and it's offensive. So
somebody else said that just on the chat recently. They said being a role model is a chore.
Yeah.
I agree. The only thing is, it's also a slight advantage, even though it is a chore, because one of the things I'd say as a very posh sounding white person is the extent to which you can, if you want to, get away with bluffing it or winging it. Okay. You know, I'm not necessarily comfortable with the phrase white privilege because, you know, as someone who'd grown up white in extremely unfavorable circumstances, it seems a very, very unfair phrase to use. Okay, but there is a kind of sort of insider privilege where you're allowed to bluff it or fake it to a far greater extent, depending on where you come from. And actually not being able to do that is probably a great advantage.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it reminded me of somebody took a Boris Johnson speech and read it out in a northeast accent. I don't know if anybody heard that. And so he went from, you know, posh bloke, you know, doing his thing to sounding almost illiterate because it was just kind of and I think you know that idea of actually the privilege of being allowed to get away with things rather than being under the microscope and the spotlight because you're the one person who's different to everybody else and you're expected to achieve.
But by the way, the solution to it for anybody, regardless of your accent or social background, is simply to move to the United States, where having any British accent, regardless of your ethnicity or background, is also a completely weird, unfair advantage.
Well, I'll see if I can get a group discount for 37 people. I'll give Virgin a ring and see if we can all emigrate. I just want to say
Rory was going to play. I thought you were going to talk about your Welsh background, Rory, and the challenges you've had there.
No, I can't. I couldn't really. I mean, the only challenge I faced actually was knowing nobody in the advertising industry and not living in a large city where there were any jobs or any role models. That's the only real disadvantage I can lay claim to. But the geography thing isn't irrelevant by any means. You know, we'll end up. And one gentleman made the point on the chat, which is, you know, people with jobs haven't got the time. And I kind of, the way I always look at this is that people with jobs haven't got the time to travel to a meeting. And the way I always put it is the opportunity cost of a 2-hour Zoom call is 2 hours of your time. The opportunity cost of a physical meeting can be anything from an afternoon to a day and a half. And so there are some huge advantages, I think, to doing something. Also, of course, being totally selfish about it, even if I'm on holiday, I'll join the trustees meeting. Okay, I'll go back in, I'll have the decency to put a shirt on, and I'll join the meeting from the hotel room. So, you know, people who are, say, recently retired or nearing retirement are understandably protective of their leisure time. And so one other advantage of that, I don't think I've missed a single meeting. I don't think I've missed a single trustees meeting since there's been a Zoom option available. And you feel bad, you feel rubbish missing the meeting.
There's a line of conversation here about trustee boards and perhaps boards in other sectors being constructed for the people that populate them. So we run them, you know, daytime meetings, board papers sent out at the last minute. Suddenly, let's meet next Thursday. Can you have a call today at 1? Actually, that doesn't suit a lot of the population, but the people that are very represented on boards, they've built that system. So how can we challenge that, Dowshan?
The gatekeepers have pretty much set the status quo, but also we do talk about technology. And there's a comment here about where you have poor signal and people in rural areas that may not have the transport links. So again, it's the responsibility of us as chairs, as gatekeepers, to set a culture where we can be flexible. Of course, I prefer things. I mean, I've worked flexibly for 20 odd years, let me add. So I've had that experience. Well, I do prefer matters face to face. But then I've always had the option of, even back in the late 90s when video technology was not like this, you'd crack a joke and there'd be tumbleweed just because of the time it took for things to materialize on the other end of the call. So we have technology that can help us, but equally you've got to understand that there are folk that can't take advantage of that. or that may have a preference elsewhere. So again, behaviourally, it comes down to setting a culture that is inclusive, and particularly given the communities that we may serve. So for an MS charity that I chair, I may have people who physically cannot get around. I need to have an option that is accommodating and representative, so I get the best out of that person. So we do have to think more broadly and behave slightly differently to having 10 folk around a table in a fixed location every 3 months at 1:30 or 5:30, being cognizant of everybody else and their needs. Just picking up on some of the other points on the chat, we've talked about privilege as well and some of the structural elements that agree. Of course, that's there, and many of us have faced those structural elements. But how do we break those down to be more inclusive? We'll talk about them, but we don't actually move into action. So the disruptive actions to break that down, starting from conversation, absolutely, but then being able to admit some of those barriers, privileges that exist, and thinking obliquely. So someone was asking earlier about how do we use poets? How do we bring disruption? Well, when it comes to recruitment panels, certainly in the academic end spectrum, I've been a fan of bringing in external perspective. So having an external person come and sit in, but also contribute and provide views. We often joke about consultants and the validation views that they bring, but having somebody not from the board, not from the community, with a completely different view, helping in recruitment and retention, let me add, exit interviews, can be critically important because they address the blind spots that you'd have otherwise. So there are a number of great points coming up online. You know, I can see that the payment question has come up again, but equally understanding those who wish to serve. When we talk about serving in civil society, it's that massive range from governorships on schools at a primary level right the way through to university level, through to the organizations that are represented here and the charities that are either known or more local. I mean, the wealth of opportunity to serve is phenomenal. So I think we also have to understand behaviorally how people wish to serve, and that for many, it might just be their local charity, the small charities that may not get the oxygen off the equivalent of the FTSE 100, the big charities that, you know, many of us here can talk about. And having that discussion, how do we improve representation on a local level? There are just some fantastic comments and questions on the chat, so we can take them. Or Penny, I can let you.
You can let me speak. It's all really interesting. I'd really like to come back to Cynthia's question in the chat, and she's messaged to say she's on a bus, so she can't speak to it. But she said, how do we use behavioural science to ensure people of diverse backgrounds trust the charity to be inclusive when it hasn't historically been diverse? So if you can see that you're joining, I mean, I say see, I use see in the broadest sense, that you're joining a board of people who are different to you, what can we do there?
Well, that's a great question, isn't it? Because we're talking about trust and how do you demonstrate trust? And I guess, again, from a marketing perspective, we talk about brands, and I always fall back on the very traditional definition of a brand from Procter & Gamble that I learned very early in my career, and that is a brand is a promise delivered. That is it. What is the promise and how are you delivering it? Now, we've talked about some of the behaviors people exhibit when they go to interview or when they are being interviewed, some of the behaviors that are exhibited in an organization or around a board table. How do you show inclusivity? So it's all very good having a brand and having values, but how do you live them? Of course, you can look at a picture and go, that board looks different. Or you can look at an organization and go, that organization has done something different that I wouldn't have expected them to do. A bit like when I was on a board and we were the only organization or only healthcare charity that supported the legalization of cannabis for medicinal use. And that was during Billy and Charlotte Caldwell's case. So we did something different that was in line with our values, in line with our community, that no other healthcare charity did. But we were able to then demonstrate our values through that behaviour. So I think, Cynthia, it's an absolutely great question, but you've got to live your values, you've got to live your brand, what we call brand equity, for people to then have more trust and belief in you. If you're talking diversity, like many organisations do, and I look at their executive team, and I can see people who look similar, if they look different, they've gone to the same colleges, they come from the same social background, where the bank of mum and dad have helped them, I'm going to have a different view. So you have to demonstrate that. That's the key thing.
Thank you. And I'd love to come on to disrupting the system. So disrupting the system of charity governance. You know, we've talked a lot about, I guess, how we make the existing system more diverse. But are we having the wrong conversation there, Rory? Should we be talking about, well, you know, is it the right system in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned at the very beginning about diversity of conversation, and somebody, I think, you know, said that although they are the potential gadfly in the works, the role isn't always very welcome. And I think we could reshape, and again, you know, maybe this means more frequent but more virtual meetings. We could reshape the discussion. I mean, it doesn't seem ridiculous to me once a year to have a meeting with no agenda, for example. You know, because you know, there's a wonderful point made by Jules Goddard at London Business School about the balance sheet. Is he said that board meetings start with a balance sheet. The balance sheet has one revenue line and about 6 cost lines, and the discussion tends to proceed at that ratio. So there's 6 times as much discussion about, say, you know, about outgoings as there is about how you might gain more revenue. And that was a marketer's point of view. And I think that there's a part of corporate governance which is absolutely necessary and needs to happen, but it shouldn't be allowed to dominate and frame the conversation every single time. There should be occasions for much more experimental thought and discussion, or go to a trustees meeting and go to the pub afterwards. Might be a partial solution to that.
But equally, taking Jules's point, we talk about transformation, whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, it's big change. How can we be disruptive? But yet we're looking at the marginal. So using the financials, we're looking at the balance sheet, we're looking at efficiencies, we're looking at small changes here and there, as opposed to the top line number and being transformative, or for the communities we serve, the transformative experiences that we can give them, be it a local organisation or a much larger organisation. I think, again, going back to the comments, there's a thread, I think, about neurodiversity and making materials more welcoming for potential directors. Again, I'm going to say this regardless of sector. This is something very personal to me. I've seen board packs, particularly in healthcare, in academia, some organisations, private, public and civil society, that are so thick when they were sent out, the person from the post office cannot deliver them. The doorbell would ring. With one of my other board positions, I've had that happen. I've been copied on. It's not sustainable, I know, but physical board packs that do not fit through the letterbox. And I'm not bragging here. I've got quite a big letterbox. It doesn't fit through.
I brought, you may have noticed, I brought Frances Brown in here with her permission. I've been chatting with her. Frances is a governance expert. And also an inclusion expert. And I think what we're talking about here, disrupting the system, what's wrong with how we're currently running meetings. I'd love to hear your reflections, Frances, on what we're getting wrong at the moment. So there's, you know, the formulaic meetings and how actually disrupting all that might really suit a wider group of people coming into our boardrooms, but also the people that are already there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that boards seldom do is have a conversation about the members that are there, including new members that they've come on, about ways of working. How do we work? So what you end up doing is coming into a system that's got a pattern of how it works, it's got a culture of how it works, and you have to navigate that which you've come into, rather than it adapting and flexing, which means that you often don't then get the best out of individuals who've joined those boards. So, you know, one of the questions that I posed was, what do you do with boards who seek to diversify, but then struggle themselves to adapt to different perspectives? And that's one of the key challenges that boards often have. And after time, and I think back to the session that we did earlier, which was about speaking up. Over time, people lose their voice because they no longer feel that it's worth the effort for them to speak, let alone whether they get a chance and opportunity to contribute.
So France, I think, that's a great thing. And there are two things there. One, we talk about the formulaic approach, and people who know me well are used to you not do it on a one-pager with bullet points. One of my former mentors and ambassadors said a board meeting should be a conversation, not a series of PowerPoint presentations. Now, when you put that into play, and when you take out these, and I have seen them, 800, 900-page board packs that are still common across our NHS, across the investments field, across many organisations, you are not going to get a quality meeting with that pack. So one of the boards, well, actually, pretty much all boards I'm on, and I'm quite strong about this, I just asked for a one-pager. So suddenly board packs go from a couple of hundred pages. I've now got one board pack down to about 40 pages. And that includes all the standard reports, the governance procedures, risk registers, everything. It means that we, as directors and trustees in another organisation, read it well, comment, and then we have a conversation with the relevant person, not the CEO, but the person who's done the work. She or he could be 1, 2, 3 levels below the CEO, but they come in and they present. And when I say present, they converse. It's a conversation. So what it does, it exposes the very junior talent as well to the board. It gives them confidence. Hopefully it gives them some appreciation that we do some work on boards, but also we listen, and it encourages them to apply in the future. So by playing with formats, and people may joke about SOAP, statement on a page, that's the acronym, or the fabled one-page memo from P&G again. It actually allows you to have a better conversation, a better board discussion and outcome, but also champion the talent from within. I think, Francis, your second point there about organisations that aim to diversify but struggle to adopt. I'll go back to what Rory was saying. Again, disrupt the status quo. Have the conversations that invert the balance sheet to P&L, that invert how you're spending money to how you're raising money, you're generating income in a civil society organisation. Have a meeting where there's no agenda, where you have a truly open strategic day, or you bring a facility to let the imagination fly and ask the questions you wouldn't normally ask.
By the way, one thing I have noticed is you get certain chairs, and it's a very valuable skill, and I really, really reflect it, whose amazing talent is getting through every single agenda item on time and finishing 3 minutes early without allowing for any digression or anything else. My only caveat about that is particularly relevant in terms of diversity, and it's why I'm not being entirely flippant saying go to the pub afterwards, is this. There is both a curse and a miracle in human psychology and human anthropology, which is we tend to form into in and out groups, which is the kind of curse. The miracle is it takes very little for two people to find in common for them to identify as part of an in-group. It could be a shared sporting affiliation, it could be a shared place where they live, place where they grew up, holiday destination. Almost anything allows people to become part of an in-group. I arbitrarily, just before Christmas, have a kind of, because I live in Sevenoaks, I have a kind of lunch for Ogilvy people who live in southeast London and Kent, okay? It's a complete mixture. I'm the vice chairman, but the guy who runs the mail room comes along because he lives in Bromley. It's a complete mixture of ethnicities, genders, social backgrounds, but we completely bond over effectively one arbitrary shared attribute. Now, obviously, the downside of that is we spend half the time saying that everybody who works in Ogilvy and lives in Essex or Surrey is a complete arsehole and should be fired. But I'm joking. Okay. But you can actually, people can bond and identify and forge shared goals around very, very little. And so if you don't allow the opportunity for those little coincidences to emerge, you're actually destroying something magical.
Definitely. I'm just going to bring Frances back in because she just wants to make a point on board packs.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back because I thought you made a really good point about board packs, and oftentimes authors of them are using it as an opportunity to, I don't know, show off. Sometimes there's a little bit of ego in putting papers together and showing how clever they've been and how much work they've done. But you know, one of the best chairs I knew, he would actually judge a paper not by how verbose you'd been and whether you could use florid language, is by how few papers there were. The fewer the papers that you submitted, the fewer pages you submitted, the better. But it is a challenge for people to write succinctly and concisely.
Yeah.
And obviously, and you're absolutely right, that space is for conversation, not for reading papers. And one of the key challenges that I often hear, and from trustees themselves, is that they don't feel that their fellow board members read the papers.
Yeah. So the behaviour change there is have material that's consumable, but the most important thing, it's a conversation. A good board meeting is a conversation. It's not a chance to show off. It's a chance for you to learn, understand, appreciate, and celebrate. Definitely celebrate. We don't do enough of that. The work that you're doing and the work that your team are doing. By doing that, it's not just a conversation with groupthink around a board table, which rarely is representative of a community they serve, with the handful of executives and the CEO. The behaviour that I'd like to see, and with all my board meetings, I have an organisation I chair in the UK called Board Apprentice. I always have somebody from the executive who's there observing, just learning by observation, who as a chair, I can invite their opinion into the meeting or have them covered under D&O insurance, but bring the different talent in, make sure the talent that's doing the work is represented as well, regardless of level. It's not for the CEO to present, and allow them to speak. What you're doing is you're inspiring the next generation of board leaders anyway, and giving them very early exposure.
And I'm afraid, I'm so sorry, Dowshan, but we're going to have to wrap up because it's 2 minutes to 8 and we've got so much more to talk about. Rory, did you want to make a final?
Only two very strange practices which are worth noting. Two eccentric company practices. At Tesco, you're not allowed to have any kind of brainstorming unless there are at least 2 store managers present. So in other words, someone where the wheels touch the tarmac has to be present. And at Amazon, every single meeting starts in 10 minutes. I've been in them with 10 minutes of silence while people read and reread the agenda to the meeting and think about it deeply in silence before you're allowed to start talking. It's slightly creepy and weird, but it probably has some upside.
Really interesting, and I'm sure, I mean, there's 2 things there we could absolutely take into the charity sector, aren't there? Thank you so much. It's been a kind of wild hour, which is what Dowshan told me it would be, and lots of food for thought. I'm still thinking about how we can adapt to different perspectives. I'm still thinking about Rory's point about that we just don't allow for digression in the way that we run our trustee meetings. I'm thinking about the in-out groups and how we can, take down some of those barriers. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Daisy just to wrap up for the final minute.
Thank you so much, Penny. So you'll see that I've just added into the chat a couple of links just to talk through very quickly. One is an evaluation form, a couple of minutes of your time, but it'd be really helpful for us to see what you find valuable and what you'd like us to do more of. You can also see the rest of our festival events that we've got coming up. We're bang on halfway through, so there's still lots more to come over the next 2 days. It would be great for you to join us. This week we have just launched our brand new guide about how to diversify your charity's board. It's an absolutely fantastic free resource, so there's the link to go and download it, and then also the link to our website more generally, which is full of loads of resources all year round to help you on your journey, whether that's about trustee diversity, trustee recruitment, or becoming a trustee yourself. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you over the next couple of days as well. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, Penny. Getting on Board team. Take care.